I'm James Harding. Welcome. There are so many people in this room who've been engaged in our global AI index from the start. I'm just going to age you. We've been at this thing for 6 years. It's like an amazing thing. And genuinely, I'm going to do everything I can, 2 minutes of throat clearing, and then I'm going to hand over to Joe and Serena and Patricia, who, for those of you who've been around this thing long enough, know have done the work and been really sequestered away for months, coming up with something I think that is really interesting and also, for the first time I think in a couple of years, like really profoundly different. The 4th of December, 2025 is, of course, as all of you in this room will know, the 234th birthday of The Observer. On this day in 1791, the first issue of The Observer was published with the promise to share all species of knowledge that conduces to the happiness of society. And I'd love to tell you that we are this good that we thought, you know what, why don't we try and marry a look at the future of information with the birthday of a newspaper dedicated to the distribution of knowledge. But we weren't. We just happened to book it on the 4th of December and then got up this morning and thought, okay, what a happy coincidence that is. But it also allows me to do one other thing, which is we bought The Observer because I think we had a belief, those of us who worked in Tortoise, that it was a similar spirit, that we'd set up Tortoise with this idea that we wanted to slow down, wise up, make sense of the world. And here was this Sunday newspaper, which for a couple of 100 years had been different from the rest of the press, had said, we're going to take a little bit longer to try and observe, witness what was happening in the world and make sense of it. And so it has been a happy marriage. It's been a happy marriage also because we've tried to bring some digital nous to all of the authority and expertise that sits in The Observer. And that's culminated, for us at least, with getting to a new starting line. As you may have seen, we've done a fair bit of kind of tooting our horn last week on Thursday. For the first time in those 233 years, you could buy The Observer, not just on a Sunday, but any day of the week, anywhere in the world, in our app. And I say that because now I get to boast again about something that I had next to nothing to do with. If you look at the app and you look at the Global AI Index today, I don't know if you've downloaded the Observer app, you're all allowed to get out your phones now and do it if you haven't. It does what we've always really wanted to do, which is take information that is available to a very small number of people in terms of understanding how the global race for AI is really shaking out and make it available to everyone, because we think that something really profound is happening here. And one of the reasons I'm so proud is that the app and the treatment of the graphics tells you in a very immediate way how the world is changing, how Britain's place in it is changing, the gap between the US and China is changing, the nature of the new competitors, UAE, Singapore, the influence those countries are having. I think it makes you understand the world we live in and the times we live in differently. And that's really been our aim from the very start. And so I'm going to hand over to Joe White and Serena Cesario and to Patricia Clark, who between them have, through the data, through interpretation of the data and interpretation of what that means in our journalism, I hope made a little sense of AI and the global race for competitiveness in it. So with that, Joe, over to you.
Over to me. Thanks,
Serena,
James.
you started.
Is this working? Yes. So I'm sure many of you are already familiar with what the Global AI Index is, but just to tell you a little bit about how it works. We've been running this, as James said, since 2019. And it's essentially a ranking of countries based on artificial intelligence capacity. So we measure capacity looking at 108 different indicators from 24 public and private sources that we organize across these 3 pillars and sub-pillars. So innovation, implementation, and investment, research, development, talent, operating environment, which is kind of social readiness of AI, infrastructure, and government strategy. every pillar and sub-pillar is weighted differently depending on how much the indicators that form parts of it are relevant to AI, contribute to AI capacity, and how comprehensive the data is. This year, we've expanded the list of countries to 93 to account for the governments that have published an AI strategy in the past year. And we've added an EU aggregate, which is not part of the ranking, but it's helpful as an analysis tool to kind of see how the EU would perform if it was treated as a country. And I'll hand over to Joe.
So these are this year's rankings, which you would have already seen on the leaflet. I mean, if there's any one big story from this year's rankings overall, I think it's sort of, you see this shift away from the established West towards sort of these rising powers in Asia and sort of the Middle East. But to sort of go through the rankings individually. So I think in the top two places, we have the United States and China. I think there's no big surprise there. That is always how it's been. I think actually the big difference we see this year is we see China really rapidly closing the gap. And that is, they've jumped to sort of 74. So if the US scores 100, sort of the highest possible score, we see China essentially as within sort of 26 points out of 100. And that is partially, we've made a big effort to sort of try and measure China accurately. It's difficult. It's a closed sort of information economy. But actually, they just have caught up in so many areas, which I'll talk about, particularly sort of on open source AI and sort of embodied AI and robotics. And so actually, there is now a sense that the US was always dominant, but sort of there are areas where China is pulling ahead. And then you have, in third and fourth place, you have Singapore and the UK. The Singapore is mainly good because sort of it does really well across per capita metrics. The UK holds on to fourth. It actually more or less is tied now with South Korea. You do, over the past few years, see this gradual erosion of the UK's position. So last year it was sort of a few points ahead of the next country, and this year it really is sort of just about ahead. The UK is still very strong in research, on sort of its commercial ecosystem. Increasingly, we sort of see infrastructure as the bottleneck. So compute infrastructure in the UK is quite limited. Actually, the UK's energy prices are a real sort of barrier to sort of building out more computing infrastructure. And now South Korea is sort of breathing down their neck. South Korea are sort of focusing a lot on their own sovereign AI. They have developed some very impressive models, maybe not quite the research output of the UK, but they are getting close. We see some sort of overall churn in the next, I suppose, what we call the middle powers of AI. So Germany are down, Israel are up. And then in the top 10 for the first time, we have the UAE, which is sort of, it's jumped about 10 places this year. And every year, sort of, since we started doing this, we see them jump quite rapidly. And part of that is the huge amount they are investing. I think everyone knows sort of Stargate. Actually, what we see is they've been doing this for the last few years, and now they are just improving in every area, from research to talent. It's not just sort of capital, it's actually from their sort of universities, so the G42, this big tech conglomerate company they have, they are really becoming very sophisticated beyond just sort of splashing cash. And I just wanted to break down a little bit more about how the index is composed. So we tend to break down the index into what we call scale, which is about absolute metrics, so like the number of GPU clusters in a country, and then also intensity, which is about the relative per capita performance. So, for example, the number of research scientists per capita, with the idea that, so if you look here, you can see these small, rich countries, Singapore, Israel, Switzerland, which do very, very well on intensity, and obviously it's the US and China are dominating on scale, as you might expect. I think something we've done this year is to add the EU in to our analysis. And I think maybe what should be alarming to EU policymakers is obviously, I think they are behind the US and China on scale, which you might expect. The EU is now also, from our data, behind China on intensity, despite having 1/3 of the population, about 3 times richer in terms of GDP per capita. We see that actually on a lot of metrics, China per capita is doing better than the EU. So those are sort of the main findings of the index. And I think we just go through and talk about some of the findings, sort of the most interesting findings that have come out of the data.
Yeah.
Okay.
Another European heart broken. I get it. Yeah.
So one of the findings we've had, and this is probably the most dramatic change we've seen within the course of a year, is I mentioned sort of China are rapidly closing the gap. There are areas where China it's not closed the gap anymore. China is actually taking the lead. And I think the big area is in open source AI. So obviously the big sort of frontier models from OpenAI and Google are sort of represent the cutting edge. China are now leading in this open source area. And this has happened within the space of about 2 years. So if you look at this chart, which shows sort of which are the most popular open source models and from what country, around sort of the beginning of 2024, that is mostly a European and American picture. This is largely Meta and France's Mistral. And in the space of about 2 years, Chinese developers, so everyone's heard of DeepSeek, but actually also Alibaba, and then a number of smaller AI Chinese startups have released very, very impressive models that have been adopted sort of everywhere. So this is not just Chinese developers using Chinese AI. These models are now sort of used widely in Silicon Valley. And the reason is they are very good, not quite the level, sort of the frontier, like, ChatGPT or Gemini, but they are sort of good, and they are good enough to be used for business operations. And they are good while being significantly cheaper and sort of more efficient to run in many cases. The Chinese developers don't have access to sort of the chips or the compute that the American labs do, and they've basically used a lot of smart engineering to sort of squeeze out as much performance as they can. And they're released on these permissive models for open source that allows anyone to take and use them. So that is one of the biggest changes this year. I think it's worth saying that this has changed dramatically in the space of a year. It could change again. There is not an inherent advantage the Chinese have on open source. And if the US labs have sort of lost that lead, it is largely because for the last few years, Google or OpenAI have chosen to sort of prioritize closed source. I think the Americans have now woken up to this fact that they are losing in open source, and we see from the US AI Action Plan, there's this renewed focus on actually we do need to lead open source. They call it sort of geostrategic importance, that we are leading on this. And just in the last few weeks, we've seen a few models from not actually the big tech labs, but sort of these smaller AI startups in the US and research labs that actually are very impressive open source models. The Americans, if they want to, can compete on this. And so in a year, this graph may look very different again.
And then some other findings that we thought were interesting. This one is about adoption of AI. And this was actually taken from data published in a quite recent Microsoft study, which tracks what they call AI user share. So this is the proportion of the population that regularly uses platforms like ChatGPT, DeepSeek, and others. And what we thought was interesting here is that, first of all, you can see that the rich countries are the ones where people are adopting AI more quickly. The one up there is the UAE, and in the UAE and Singapore, over half of the population uses AI regularly. But the really interesting bit is that the US is actually ranking quite low in terms of number of people that use AI, these kinds of platforms, regularly, and I think it's about 25% or less than 25% in the US. Less than 25% of the population uses AI, which kind of contrasts with the US being number one in who is actually building the AI. I think this is interesting in the sense that it may, if you pair it with other data that we have that is measuring trust in AI, you can see that in the US and other countries, but in the US, the prevalent feeling is that people don't trust AI as much for a number of different reasons that have to do with misinformation online, creative industries struggling, and also jobs, obviously. And it's an interesting observation that the kind of strategy of the US of being first and developing AI quickly may end up resulting in lower adoption because of this kind of we get there first attitude that may lead to people trusting it less and so therefore using it less.
And you should understand, are we saying there these are use of defined AI platforms, so your Claudes and your ChatGPTs?
Yeah.
We're not talking about the extent to which you may or may not use a banking app, or you may or may not use a Google, which will be AI driven. It's specific AI.
Large language models, isn't it?
Yeah.
Oh, okay,
So
great.
it's sort of, I suppose the distinction is sort of these are platforms where people are sort of going out to seek them,
Right.
in a sense, sort of rather than something that sort of you passively accept if you're already using Google.
So so this is actually a metric of you're saying about suspicion.
Yeah, exactly.
To an extent, yeah.
And one last one is about the UK. And the UK So what's really good about the UK that we find in our data is that the UK has some of the best AI talent, AI scientists and engineers, and also some of the best universities. It's specifically the UK hosts the largest concentration of AI research scientists, and is also third in terms of computer science educational institutions. But what we see is that Britain retains fewer than half of its top AI research scientists. And if we compare it to France and South Korea, which we see are at similar levels of AI development, they retain between 60 and 70%, and the US retains about 80% of its top AI researchers. And this obviously has an effect on the domestic AI startup ecosystem, where it seems that the problem that the UK faces is lower access to capital, AI infrastructure, and good talent networks. In terms of investment, the UK attracted about £2 billion of private funding in 2024, which is still the best in Europe. And it's third in the world after the US and China. And we can talk more about, why it is that the top talent in the UK is leaving the UK, also mostly to America. But it seems that the UK AI industry is relying quite heavily on foreign countries, and also is competing increasingly with them, especially with the US, for talent, for investment, infrastructure, compute, and so on.
And by the way, do we think that in that 100% the best people go?
In that 100%?
Do we think that the dark blue and the light blue are the best people out of that 100%?
This is already the top people.
So they're all excellent.
Yeah.
Okay.
This is like the top, this is sort of the cream of the crop. It's like the top 10,000.
Okay.
And to be honest, even the people that sort of stay in the UK, the really good ones do end up Google DeepMind, which is obviously, Google DeepMind's great, but there is also a question of, I suppose it's a question of sovereignty, which is we have really good research scientists. Most of the really cream of the crop, they are at DeepMind in London, or they are at the branches of other, Microsoft, Meta. The really good people are at the US branches, the branches of US tech firms in London. And actually, there's quite a small percentage of this really top talent at what we might call, domestically headquartered countries in the companies in the UK, so like Wave or something.
And so, Joe, what was I don't know, were we about to come to it? Sovereign AI, the South Korean example.
Yes, I mean, I think the reason we're talking about this is, a lot of people ask us, well, why does it matter if actually we have all these great research scientists if they're sort of not at a UK headquartered company? If they're in London, surely that's good. And there is this question of sovereignty, which is okay, but they're working at these US tech companies, so actually, A, a lot of the benefits go to those companies outside, goes outside the UK, and B, we end up with less control. I think this is obviously an index about AI capacity, but increasingly people have asked us about sovereignty. And the UK is fourth in terms of capacity. If this were hypothetically as sort of an AI sovereignty index, the ranking would look very different. And it would probably be the US, it would be China, and then it would be South Korea. And the UK would be pretty far down, we think. The reason is that South Koreans have taken this approach where they basically want to do everything in-house. And actually, they are among what we call the middle powers of AI. They are one of the few countries which can actually do this. So they have these tech conglomerates, SK Telecom, Naver, LG, which in the last few years have essentially, with their own data, because the Koreans have very good data assets, they have trained their own models on their own compute infrastructure, on NVIDIA chips still, but increasingly the South Koreans are pushing their own neural processing networks, units, and built these very, very good models. They're not quite at the level of the US frontier, but industry estimates are about 6 months behind, and then distributed them on their own platforms. So in terms of sovereignty, they have the data, they have the compute, they have the tech firms the research expertise, and then they have the ability to distribute. The UK does not really have the compute yet. We don't really have the big tech firms, and therefore we don't really have the ability to distribute. So in terms of sovereignty, the UK is missing a lot of pieces. And actually, most other countries that aren't Korea or the US or China, Mistral, France has Mistral, but maybe not sort of the platform for distribution. The UAE maybe doesn't have the research expertise yet, despite having G42. So the South Koreans alone are really unique in having the sort of both the will and the capability to do this all in-house, all made in Korea, for other countries, middle powers, particularly the UK, it is a choice between how much do you want to do sovereign AI versus how much do you want to make sure you get the best AI from the US and China, at the risk of sort of increasing your dependence on them.
I think we have to have a think about what we mean by sovereignty and whether sovereignty means anything at all. We could build all of our data here. We don't have the data centers here. We don't have the energy capacity to do that. The amount of money and energy it would cost to build a frontier LLM here in the UK and then to find the market for that when so many people are already using ChatGPT and Claude and whatever else, it might not actually be worth it for us. And so then the conversation, and I think the decision that's been made in government has been, okay, how do we build on top of this? How do we bring our stellar research and add a layer on top of that and build, fantastic medical, healthcare, biotech AI, build stuff that we're really specialized in. And I mean, what's been so interesting has been Serena's fascinating research on the fact that we're losing so much of that talent. And we're not, we're kind of failing on both sides right now.
Some of the points that were made when I was speaking to people about this, one of them is that there is this feeling that in UK universities and research labs, there's less of an entrepreneurial spirit than there is in the US. And the number of AI companies that come out of these research labs is nowhere near comparable the number of companies that come out of Stanford or other top universities in the US.
Can we also just talk for a minute about the UAE example? Like, what are we seeing there? Because that's, I know I take your point, Joe, about just the rise of the UAE, but there's also kind of domestic spend, and then we had this piece this morning about spend in Africa, the reach. What's going on?
So, I mean, I had a conversation, this is in relation to Saudi Arabia a while ago. Saudi Arabia announced Humane. They were going to build this full stack AI, frontier model, and all of these data centers. And when that was announced, I was so skeptical. I was like, how are you going to build data centers in the desert? They famously require all this cooling. Where are you going to get specialized engineers? And I called up all these people, and this one very nerdy AI hardware analyst said to me, look, you throw enough money at something, you can get the job done. Mm-hmm. And that's been really the lens through which I've been trying to understand this index is, okay, if people have been throwing money at this problem, are we starting to see results? And the UAE for us, I mean, I remember 5 years ago when I started working on this index, they were the first country to have an AI minister. They were plowing money into this before they even, I think, really knew what they were doing. And now we've seen them rise 10 points or 10 places in our index. That's partly because they've built, I think, a decent model, the first kind of Arabic language model. They've got good adoption within their citizens. And so they are really kind of progressing on that point. And a lot of that is just because of the commitment from government. The thing that's been more interesting to me editorially is that in addition to that, they've also, unlike Saudi Arabia, said, okay, we're going to try and use this as a kind of policy tool, and we're going to invest very, very heavily in the global south and specifically in Africa. So Hannah Schuller, who's sitting over there and who's been a huge part of this index, I mean, has collected so much data on these partnerships that they've been announcing. So I think there's 20 partnerships in Africa worth about 2.2 billion. That's everywhere from, I mean, remind me of the countries, I mean, everywhere.
Senegal, Eswatini, Burkina Faso, Ivory Coast. I mean, they're not countries you necessarily expect have the most robust tech industries to begin with, and let alone AI infrastructure.
And what are the partnerships, Hannah?
They're fairly varied. I mean, some of them look like they're offering them government services that will have AI integrated in them, and a lot of them rest on this Falcon model that the UAE have constructed. Other ones are data centers where they say that the country that the data center is being hosted in, for example, in Angola, they said they're going to construct 3 data centers that are going to be the biggest in the region. They say they'll offer both the Angolans and the UAE companies priority for using them, which I suppose is advantageous. And obviously, they say they're going to hire local talent, which appeals to the government there to sign it. Other ones seem more like friendly treaties that are angled at benefiting their diplomatic relationships on a global scale, but they're very varied.
Before I'm going to ask Victor and Imran and Julia just to come up in a second. We're going to swap out. But are there questions or views on what the index has told us so far? Does anyone want to weigh in on what you've heard? Yes.
I've got a question about this academic thing.
So will you say your name? Sorry.
I'm Matthew, and I was in a publishing company. I'm now doing an AI for marketers startup.
Cool.
Yeah, nice. Called Digital Clock. I'm interested in, because I'm trying to reach out to tech people to help build my model, and I'm wondering why the Americans do it so well. Does the pressure come from the government to commercialize, or do you think that the universities have the pressure to commercialize?
So what I've gathered from the conversations that I've had with founders and investors and researchers is it seemed that the core of the problem or the difference is that America have so much more capital than the UK has, and talent tends to move where the money is a little bit. And when I was trying to understand the difference in salaries, for example, I found out that AI engineers in America earn up to $500,000 a year, which if you compare it to the UK is about £150,000 a year. So it's a huge gulf. And I see that seems to be the case with so many other things where the US is just investing a lot more money with a more agile environment, easier fast-track visas for AI talent, a more predictable policy environment, tax frameworks that are more favorable for AI companies. So I think it's a mix of things, but my sense is that it all, like at the very bottom of it, there's just so much more capital available.
Yes. Shikelia.
Hi. Yes, sorry. On this, what struck me, because many years ago I did some research for the Wellcome Foundation on pharma, is identical, biotech pharma. So you have high academic excellence, and then all what they call translation into commercial moves to the US. So the people, the talent, the investment, the money. So essentially you have a flow of IP that from the UK, where you have excellent academic institution, they cannot translate into commercial or even government outcomes, and they move to the US, also because of language, commonality. It's very easy to transfer. So there's this migration. And I remember at the time the Wellcome Foundation was trying to figure out, we put all this money in biotech UK, but it all ends up to being translated in Stanford. Yeah. And that's exactly identical. So I think it is sort of the destiny of the UK model to be very non-protectionist, smaller scale, more academic. All the IP goes to the US where the big money is, and then this repeats in AI. So it's actually and then obviously if you believe in free market and you're not protectionist like Korea or others, that's compounded. So it's sort of a choice of what you want to be, right? So you can be there, but you have to realize that then that will be the flow, particularly for the UK.
Yeah.
And the problem seems to be that the startup are struggling to stay here when they scale. So the UK is still a great place to start an AI company, but when you start to have to raise funds around £100 million, for example, then and you really want to scale, then that's the moment when founders and companies move to the US.
Could we? So, Hannah wants to say here. Yeah. Thank you, Lily. Sorry. Thanks very much.
I'm Nico from the Alan Turing Institute. Thanks very much for the very interesting presentation. Have you noticed any changes due to geopolitical effects? So, we talk to researchers all the time. What we're finding is lots of US scientists are looking to exit, not looking to stay. Have you started to notice in the data some effects that this might have? Or is AI, an outlier in that instance?
I think, and I mean, this is in terms of our people exiting the US. I think actually there's some quite recent data from Zeki. I think Tom is in the audience here. He can maybe speak more to it. But actually, am I right in saying that in the last until now, the US has been this enormous magnet, sort of this brain drain for every country, and very recently that has sort of slowed down a bit or even stopped. So I think you do immediately see that. In terms of geopolitics, I think what you may see sort of less on sort of the individual data is actually we start to see camps emerging. Sort of basically the US and the China are increasingly becoming these sort of two poles, and they are increasingly sort of combative with each other. You start to see countries, some countries like hedge their bets, but actually you start to see some countries say, okay, we should probably align ourselves with one of these two camps. So just to go back to the UAE, one of the big things that the UAE has done in the last few years via G42, which is this sort of UAE tech conglomerate, is they basically picked their side with the Americans. So they used to work with both the Chinese researchers and companies and the Americans. And in the last few years, they basically decided actually we should go all in with Microsoft. And they basically stripped out all of their sort of Chinese expertise. They sort of made sure that they were just American chips in their infrastructure, and basically went deeper and deeper into partnership with Microsoft. And now, in the last few weeks, what you've seen is the US has approved the sale of like the most powerful NVIDIA chips to the UAE because there is sort of this alignment. So you sort of start to see various camps emerging. Yeah.
So, do you want to just talk about whether or not you are seeing anything meaningful on that drain out of the US?
Joe's absolutely right.
Or just take a mic, will you, Tom?
Joe's absolutely right. If you look at that top bar, I mean, when we look at the top, let's say the top 400,000 AI researchers in America, 40% of them are not of American origin. They've gone to America to advance their research and to pursue career opportunities. And that number of kind of 40% has accumulated over the last 15 years. Over the last 15 years, there's been a very, very sharp drop in the inflows to America over the last 5 or 6 years, and it's now basically zero. So it's sort of net. America is no longer absorbing global talent. But the big reason for that is that Indian talent has stopped going to America because, of that 40% of non-US origin talent in America, 70% of it is Indian.
Tim, you're just behind, and I'm going to come to you. Yeah.
So I've been a big fan of your index for 6 years, and in the course of those 6 years, the amount of money, you're literally describing a rocket ship, which is, 6 years ago, OpenAI was having to get $1 billion from Microsoft. They're now committed to 1.4 trillion of spend. The number of researchers in the space has probably gone up, 5, 6, 7 times. The sheer volume of cash and power now being projected is amazing. And yet the ranking on the top level hasn't changed massively. Every year you sort of say, what's the story? Oh, look, UAE's gone up a bit. It's great. Singapore's replaced the UK. It's not massively shifted, but this huge shift is happening underlying it in terms of the data. When do we see that shake out? When do we see actually the rankings begin to reflect the sheer violence of the capital deployed, the sheer scale of the changes potentially happening?
Yeah, but can I understand, Tim? Are you saying you're not seeing the shift in the data as regards the United States, given that's where
no, your rankings every year look a bit like that. Right. And so every year your rankings look a bit like that. Maybe UAE jumps up 10 points, or Singapore edges across the UK, or Canada shifts down a bit. Every year you're slightly looking for what's the big exciting story. But the underlying vector of change is like, the spend has probably doubled every single year. The number of researchers is trebled, quadrupled, whatever it might be. So I just wondering why there's going to come a moment where there'll be a reshuffling of the world order, if you like. Right. Is this the moment where actually, Europe finally falls behind, the new rising powers come through, India takes its rightful place at the top table? I don't know. Or do you think actually we're going to keep with this current mix and it's going to be the same for the next 20 years?
I think there's a separation between, let's say, the top 10, which is this sort of middle powers, and then everyone else. In the top 10, we do sort of see some overall stability. There has been sort of churn this year, but actually, all of the countries here, obviously, the UAE is spending huge amounts of money. The Koreans sort of jump over the year. They are all very serious about AI, and all of their governments are, I think maybe with the exception of Germany, which seem to be taking it slightly less seriously, are all doing a lot. If you look beyond the top 10, then actually what we see, that's where we see like the real change, and we see sort of countries really rapidly rising up. So that's where we see a lot of European countries have been gradually dropping. So sort of outside the really big players like the UK and France, you see a lot of other European players sort of significantly dropping year by year in the ranks. And then you see these Asian countries. So I think the ones I pick out is obviously the UAE we've talked about, but actually also Taiwan and Malaysia are two countries that every year they sort of jump up 5, 10 places. And both in those cases, both those governments have sort of made large commitments to AI. Taiwan sort of on the infrastructure, the chip level, and then Malaysia actually, kind of because of their proximity to Singapore, have sort of actually built up quite a large sort of set of data centers and are now trying to translate that from just, we don't want you to sort of serve computing power to Singapore, we actually want to do this ourselves. So the churn, sort of the big changes actually right now are happening sort of below that top 10. And I think it's in the next few years, we will start to see some of those countries actually rise up, and actually what we'll see is maybe countries like Germany, which have gradually slipped year by year throughout the rankings, drop out of the top 10.
But can I get your point too. Just sort of, Patricia, just are we doing something wrong in this? In that if you actually look at where the spend is, the US and China, but the US in particular, is so far out in front of what everyone else is spending. Do you think we're not sort of properly representing the gap
between the US and China and everyone else?
Yeah.
So
come on.
I think it sort of depends a bit on how much. So a lot of the US spend, like they are spending enormous amounts of money and enormous amounts of capital, particularly on data centers. A lot of that is very, very focused on this idea about AGI. They are very in on LLMs. They are very in on sort of AGI, and we just have to get to AGI first. And if that is how it plays out, where there is this thing called AGI and the Americans get it first, and then sort of once you start using that, the results compound, then sort of there is no chance for everyone else. If actually it turns out that sort of, okay, AGI, whatever we call AGI, is sort of actually a bit further out than we think, or maybe it's sort of not achievable in the way that maybe some of those tech firms believe, that, and actually what happens is that the open source models developed by China, or actually developed by other countries as well, are maybe not quite as good as the US frontier of LLMs, but sort of good enough that actually they can do a lot and you don't need the frontier stuff. And also there are all these other areas of AI. So right now, the US is so in on LLMs, but there's sort of embodied AI, there's sort of world models, there's all these other spaces that can do things that LLMs, with all their amazing capabilities, are still limited. Then actually some of that enormous spend of the US just looks like misallocated capital. And so your belief about how big do you think the gap between the US and other countries are is in some level less based on the data and based on how far do you think the current US approach of AGI or bust is valid.
So one question here, yes.
Thank you very much. Natalie Black from Ofcom. Sort of one observation and then one question. I mean, firstly, I think the theme of those countries who have even been slightly complacent, the fact it's really coming back to bite them now is really interesting. I used to live in Singapore, and I have no doubt the Prime Minister will be calling a meeting to understand why they are number 10 on government strategy. And the fact that Malaysia's number 15. But I had a question, unsurprisingly, as a regulator, about regulation. To what extent has that chilled the numbers, particularly for members of the European Union in terms of the EU Act? How does that come through on the index?
So what we don't do is we don't sort of try and directly measure regulation. We don't sort of say, okay, you've got this law, so that gives you X number of points. I mean, part of the reason is we every year to assemble this, we talk to a number of experts and to try and reach a consensus on sort of what we think is important. There is no consensus, and half the people you talk to say any sort of, it's the regulation is essentially that's why the EU is not doing good enough, and sort of you should always be measuring the opposite of regulation, sort of the more pro-innovation, the less red tape, that's better. Other experts say no, actually that's a very short-term approach, and actually in order to sort of ensure that AI is trusted and sort of developed in a way that doesn't generate sort of all sorts of problems and backlash, you should introduce regulation. I mean, I think particularly we looked a little bit at sort of we talked a bit about the survey data about the US, where there's this, particularly in the US, there seems to be quite a lot of anxiety and distrust about AI. I think part of that is sort of a response to sort of the current approach of a lot of tech companies in the US, which is we just need to do this as fast as possible. If we don't do this, the Chinese will overtake us. And there's a sense that AI is being sort of done to people rather than the participatory process. That in the long term could generate sort of all sorts of backlash against the actual wider adoption of AI in society, never mind sort of building AI. So we don't directly measure sort of regulation and try and quantify it. But I think, for example, actually the EU obviously have put their AI Act on pause right now. South Korea also have this sort of basic AI Act, which is also harm and risk based. But if you look at the nuts and bolts of the Korean AI Act, it's much more They have sort of crafted it in this sort of pro-innovation way. So the companies that are doing something new, they just have to notify the government, and the government doesn't immediately say you can't do this. And so, I mean, it's kind of almost a stupid thing to say, but it's not about sort of do you have more or less regulation, but it is the quality of the regulation. And we hope that shows up sort of through all the other indicators, where if you're regulating well, your commercial ecosystem will grow and you will be able to attract the right people to your country.
I mean, that for what it's worth, about 3 years ago, I think it's 3 years ago, there was quite a lot of talk, Tim, you'll remember this, which was, let's do an AI safety index, because that was, it's quite interesting how that blew through. We didn't do it because we couldn't work out how to do it, and it's interesting that hasn't been so much pressure. From where I sit, I see that we've catered a bottle of wine per person, so I want to make sure that we have the time to get to all of that, which means, if it's all right, Serena and Joe and Patricia, I'm going to sort of ask you to swap out with Victor and Imran and Juliet. But please join me in thanking the people who did the work. Thank you. Come in, yeah, come and sit here. Victor, I'm really afraid I should do this.
Okay.
So, and Colin, if you want to sort of raise the lights, raise the lights a bit so we can just sort of see each other properly. But the aim here is in this half hour is just to have a conversation about what we think. So I'm going to shoot some questions, but let's not wait till the end. Please just kind of catch my eye and we'll get stuck into it. I'm going to kick off, if I might, with two things. One is valuations, and the other is the UK. So if you looked at the that third slide that Serena and Joe showed, which was on open source AI, you would possibly think that. Sorry, I should have introduced everyone. Imran Shafi, when I asked someone a few years ago, who actually holds the pen in this country on writing AI policy, they said there's a guy at Bayes called Imran Shafi, he holds the pen. He now, I think, holds the pen for a company called Nscale, and is working there. So Imran, I'm going to ask you to try and say very indiscreet things about government and equally boosterish things about Nscale. Victor Ripabelli is the founder of a company called Synthesia, if I pronounced it correctly, Victor, a big AI video content platform. And Juliet Bailyn has been the person we've come to again and again to try and make sense of the relationship between capital in the founding phase of AI. She's setting up a multi-manager VC firm called Whiting. And what that basically means is you get star VCs, and then Juliet makes sure that all the money comes to you and all the services are provided for you. So Juliet, let's start with you. Are all of the big AI hyperscalers overvalued?
We often get asked about whether or not we're experiencing a bubble. And I do think valuations are notably high. They're a reflection, however, in the public markets and private markets, it's a bit different, right? And I'm a private markets person. I'm a venture capital investor by training, so I don't understand the public markets nearly as well. But it is a reflection of retail belief in something, right? We've seen that with Tesla, and we've seen that shorting Tesla is a bad idea, no matter what you think of the business. And I think the same is often true. I mean, people thought, oh, NVIDIA is going to crash. Look at all of the new things that are happening in chips. And then they, released their shareholder report and the price went up. So I think, to me, at least in the public markets, it's much more a reflection of trust. In the private markets, of course, the valuations are often too high. I think that companies stay private a hell of a lot longer. And I totally understand why that is true. If you're a founder, right, you have a lot of, you should ask Victor about this, not me, but you have a lot more, frankly, just ability to build what you want without having to constantly think about what the public markets are going to think every 30 seconds. But we've seen this consistently, and not just within AI, that companies get valued enormously in the private markets, and then you have to sort of wait existingly longer to actually go public, if you're ever going to go public, because the valuation of the private market versus what the retail investors are going to feel may or may not align. But I guess the underscore of your point is, should we be scared? Like, does this matter? Mm-hmm. And this sort of relates to the question about if we're in an AI bubble, which is, I don't love that analogy, mainly because previous bubbles that people refer to, especially in technology, like the dot-com bust or what happened in 2008, are fundamentally different because the underlying value of the assets, we've talked about this, were not there, versus in AI, the value of the underlying asset is there. So the websites being built in the dot-com bust were not valuable, and the underlying mortgage packages were not valuable. And I don't think the same is AI. So I really don't love that analogy. I don't think it works.
What do you, Victor, what do you think? What we tried to show was what was happening overall in the kind of global competitiveness. But as a founder in the UK, what do you think about UK competitiveness, infrastructure, energy costs, talent? What's the kind of lived experience of building an AI business here?
I think it's gotten a lot better. We started the business in 2017. Before the VC markets were truly, there's a lot truly global, but it's a lot better than when we started the company, right? I think there's pros and cons. I think the cons, is pretty obvious. When I go to the US to raise money in the Valley, we don't have much presence there except for me going there every few months. Nobody knows us. And that's not because they think that we're, stupid or like the company, but it's just like none of the VCs there know any of my executives. They don't know anyone who works at the company, right? So I come as this European company, and they're like, who's this guy who's building a company that claims to be better than the US competitors, which we are, but they still have this sort of weird feeling about it because they don't really know the company, and it's like this European company, which I think still comes with a tint of like, that's not as great as a San Francisco-based company.
So will you move to the US?
I'm staying here, and we're keeping the headquarters here, and I hope it's going to remain that way. Yeah, I think that's pros.
Just talk us through the balance of judgment on that.
Well, so I think the simple way of saying what I said before is like there's a European discount to valuations. It is harder to raise money. I think especially get to the later stages, it's hard for a lot of American investors to believe that European companies can be global leaders. I think we are proving that is possible. I would put us in that category. 11 Labs, Waves probably also in that category. But I think there's generally like this belief that we can do that in Europe because we haven't historically proved it. On the other hand, there are lots of positive things as well. I think talent, which we talked about before, comes at a very different price tag. I think it comes at much higher loyalty. If you are a top 5-10% company in Europe, you can hoover up a lot of great talent that's going to stay with you and stick with you even if you hit a bad quarter. If you're building in Silicon Valley, right, there's 100 different startups around you that are growing faster than you, with cooler people than you, and that is actually an issue, right? A big turnover in staff that runs around to build their own personal stock portfolio is not always great as a founder. Now, again, there's a trade-off there where, like, generally, I think it's fair to say that American employees are maybe a bit more driven. They're a bit more business savvy. Like, they want a lot of options. They want equity as part of the compensation package, which in Europe, a lot of people are still pay me a 10% better base salary rather than give me equity. So I think there are pros and cons. I think it's still easier to build a really big company in the US, for sure. But I think it's gotten a lot better than it was when we founded the company in 2017.
So Imran, can I ask you, just this UK question, forgive me, because you've been massively helpful with the AI index, and now, of course, like any journalist, I'm going to ask you a rude question. I don't know why this happens. It's kind of the editorial equivalent of karma. My confusion here is how is it that we seem to be kind of seeping competitiveness in AI, and it's not for want of political rhetoric. So what's the problem?
First of all, thanks for having us. It's something I was just talking to the team about earlier, and being at N-Scale where we're UK based but operating globally. It's just like, what does it mean to be the UK in these days? I'm not actually quite sure. We're a UK based company, but only 10% of our actual activity happens in the UK. We're building in Norway, we're building in Portugal, we're building in America, we're looking at other geographies as well. So does that make it a UK success story? I mean, we say yes, but our work in Portugal, that's also helping Portugal. And so the extent to which national boundaries sort of start to blur on some of these things, especially in Europe, where as a continent needing to think about what can different parts of the continent build together, is going to be really important. So we've built with OpenAI in Norway, Stargate Norway, where the price of electricity is cheaper than Texas, and it's all 100% hydroelectric. So if people care about the climate and care about AI and care about Europe, that's a very good place to build. If you were the UK, Prime Minister, would you want that investment to be redirected to the UK, where the electricity price is a lot higher, which is then effectively a tax on UK companies to use that compute of X% of sort of like, would you like to pay extra for access to GPUs, or would you like to use it from Norway, get it cheaper? Is that negative for the UK, that the fact that they can access that compute from Norway? Like, would it be materially better for the UK to access more expensive compute here? Probably not.
Well, so if we're backing into a conversation about rejoining the EU, I'm all in. But I suppose, Imran, the real question though is whether you consider sovereignty to be UK sovereignty or European sovereignty. I suppose, do you buy into the idea that actually, because there are two views on this, aren't there? Which is the world of AI is not going to sustain sovereignty in our old conception of it, or in fact more than ever it's going to matter, and whether or not it's by country or by region, you're going to have sovereign capabilities, and Europe's surrendering them, UK too.
I think a way I sometimes think about it is what percentage of the national leader's time is being spent pushing and driving stuff through in the space. As like Natalie was saying, I bet in Singapore that's quite high. I bet in China that's quite high. There's a lot coming out of the White House at the moment in terms of sort of the stuff they're driving. I'd be interested to like get the diaries of European leaders and sort of like look at how much time they're just like really just like absolutely pushing stuff through, and especially where the private market itself isn't going to solve these issues. Like in America, I think there's a question about universities earlier. I mean, in America, it's just sort of like the incentives are just so aligned that actually there isn't a public policy problem in the way that there is in Europe. So where there is a public policy problem, you need to then double down as a leader to like make difficult trade-offs and push that through. And I guess across Europe, people talk a lot about it. It'd be interesting to see like what the actual sort of hard substance reality of that is across different European countries.
It's really interesting. I don't know who was here. Some people were here. I think Giles might have been there. We did the Responsible AI Forum, must have been 4 years ago, maybe 4 years ago. And we invited the UAE Minister for AI, and we were all very sweet. How nice, you're the first AI minister. That must be a lovely thing. And it all felt rather ornamental and performative. Turns out it counts. I think it really counts. Julia, can I ask you a separate thing, which is about capital and capital at the VC phase, scale-up phase, and now public markets phase.
Yep.
We obviously are looking at a lot of valuations now, which are around the public markets. What's the difference at the VC level in terms of, I mean, obviously Victor's past this now, but if you're at the VC level, you're looking to build an AI business. What's Europe look like by comparison with the US?
And VC, you mean like early stage venture capital? Because I think a lot of private investors think that growth stage capital is still venture capital and late stage capital is still venture capital. And I would disagree, but that's a separate conversation. The reality is, though, and this goes to something that's just discussed earlier, I just heard this week about 3 new frontier labs that are being built here in the UK. And the smallest one is going to raise $30 to $50 million. And the largest is going to raise upwards of 200. Most of those dollars will probably come from US-based venture capital firms because they have the capacity and desire to do those types of rounds. And so from a capital perspective, I guess this goes to sovereignty. I know you didn't really ask me that question, but if you think about capital and sovereignty, I was in an event a couple months ago, and the number one conversation that was being had was, in order to get any sort of sovereignty from AI, if you assume that most of the talent or value will still accrue in some ways to US-based companies, is to have more pension dollars invested in either those companies or funds that are investing in these businesses and in these funds. And I think that's a brilliant idea. The only issue was there was not a single pension fund representative in the room. And I think we can all talk ad nauseum to ourselves. But and the reason for that is in the US, it's not even, I mean, it's what, 2 to 3% of pension fund dollars go to sort of venture capital funds, to give you an example. In Europe, it's 0.2% or 0.0, some significant difference. And so from a sovereignty perspective, I tend to agree that I don't think it is a bad thing to allow both companies and individuals and funds and government to sort of take benefit from other places. I can't speak necessarily to security and the defense requirements for that, although I'm loving all of the investment into that sector in Europe. I think it's a great thing. But I do think from a capital perspective, if you assume that people and talent are and money is going to leave, then yes, ideally, that anyone who is born in one of these countries would benefit because their ultimate pension or dollars or whatever is being invested in wherever this talent and money is flowing.
Thoughts, questions, views?
If I can add something.
Yeah, sorry, Victor, go ahead.
I think from the sovereignty perspective, right, I think it's, we talk a lot about like where the top co is, as to your point, right? Like our top co is in the UK, that's great. We're a very global business. Our biggest, revenue geography is definitely not the UK, that's definitely the US, right? But what we should talk more about is like the cap table. Where does the proceeds actually go?
Yeah.
Right? Like it took us until very late until we could raise money in the UK. So if I sell the company, if we go public, the proceeds of all the value that we've created, right, even though we're a UK-based company, is going to go by far majority to US-based funds or companies.
That's
right?
where the most of the capital raises come from.
And it is for, like, if you look at
Vast
any big
majority,
AI success story in the UK or in Europe in general, that's the case, right? And even if it is European capital, it's European branches of American funds most of the time. And that's really important, right? Because the goal is to create a lot of value for Europe as a region. Then a lot of that money actually does not end up in Europe when we get these like big success stories.
Yes. So
I'm going to disagree.
Fabulous.
Right. Hello, Eric van der Klee. So I run a venture capital fund that mainly invests in quantum companies, but I did run one that invests in AI companies. I think we should stop hand-wringing about losing value to other countries and double down on concentrating on helping even more amazing startups grow in this country that attract investment in from outside, because the deployment of capital in the UK creates a cycle of repeatable wealth and startups that then continue to thrive and also bolster the academia sources that a lot of these technologies come from. And actually, we should, I think, develop the UK into more of a factory for producing the world's best startups and attract the world's best investors into the UK to invest in our companies.
But Eric, so just to say, so when I started out as a reporter at the FT, this was a kind of article of faith, the Wimbledon theory. Right? It didn't matter who comes to. It doesn't matter the fact that we
open for business.
No, well, it was just the idea when I was growing up, we didn't have anyone who was any good at playing tennis, but we didn't care because we attracted all the best people to come and play at Wimbledon, right? Surely, Eric, you must see that in both quantum and in AI, the problem with that theory is a kind of zero-sum, winner-takes-all theory, and if they come and visit, they own everything.
That's not the case. What will happen is, instead of having 100 companies that go to the US or something each year, if you have 1,000, then you will have a residual value of 10% that will create the next Arm and the next giant in the UK. It's the volume and capacity and the reliable perpetuation of that and good value. US investors like investing here because it's better valuations.
Other views, thoughts?
Somebody over here.
Someone right at the back here. Hello.
Hello, I have a two-part question. The first is I am an AI researcher. I'm based in the UK, but my university is in the US. Before being here, I was plus 10 years in Japan. And now I'm thinking about commercializing 6 of the 8 experiments that I ran, and I'm considering where to do that. And I'm being attracted to Singapore, as is listed here, or UAE. And I'm kind of wondering on the two-part question here. The first is, why would I be incentivized to stay in the UK? What is it that the UK is offering at the moment? And the second question I have is it useful for us to continue to think about these with such geographic limitations and rings around individual countries? It sounds from what you're saying, this is becoming much more of an ecosystem play. And as you rightly pointed out earlier, you've kind of got the US, UK and the UAE aligning themselves together. You have the same with China and many of the other Asian countries. Should we not be considering about the concentrations of power across a number of countries rather than an individual nationalistic base?
Well, I think it's just like the founder's perspective is so different than like what a government thinks about, right? Like I want Europe to succeed, I want the UK to succeed. I think in reality, it matters less for founders than I think the sort of public discussion about how important it is that we're sovereign, for example, actually matters. I think if you start your company in the UK, like we did, it's a great place to start a company. I think of all the countries in the world you can start a company, it's pretty good, right? And if you're successful, you're probably going to expand to the US or wherever else you choose to go pretty quickly. 40% of my staff is in the US. And we have lots of American customers. I don't think we feel held back by being in the UK.
What are the benefits? Why? I'll say it's a great place to start and grow.
Yeah, if I could go back in time, I would definitely do it in the US instead of the UK, for sure. I think we had higher chance of success. I couldn't get a visa. I was 25 years old and I didn't want to take a job at a big tech company. So I ended up here and I'm happy with it. It's not because I wake up every morning and think I should have gone to the US, but our chances of success would definitely have been high in the US. So I think it comes down, honestly, it comes back a lot to personal preference, you know. I think we're all also humans and I prefer living in the UK than the US. One interesting trend that we have seen is that we have a New York office. I don't have a San Francisco presence. One of the things that's really difficult about Europe is when you get to a certain scale of company, I need to hire executive leadership that have actually seen what a successful high growth tech company looks like. There are very, very few. Like people who are good at the 0 to 50 million AR, 100 million AR, you can find good people. But once you need like the people who can scale from that to $1 billion of AR, that becomes really difficult. So you have to find them in the US. More than half my leadership team is from the US, right? And so we've had to go to the US and find them. And something that I found interesting was that it's been much easier for us to find great people in San Francisco and move them to London than to move them to New York. Because as much as a lot of people who live in London, you know, I think don't like it, and the whole sort of, I think, brand about the UK is not very good. For a lot of people, the idea of moving 4 years to London with their family and enjoying Hyde Park and the culture and you're close to things in Europe is actually a great benefit. And so I think if we really want to win on the global stage, some of the things we can do is improve the brand. I think we can do things like get great people in and not just talk about it, give them tax benefits, 2 years with no income tax. Yeah. Like I'm from Denmark, right? And we actually did that many, many years ago. And that scheme worked pretty well. We attracted people from all over the world who felt the idea of moving to Denmark for 4 years was interesting. And they had a good economic incentive to do it as well. Those are very small things that's not going to be very noticeable in the budget if we're talking about 300 executives. I think we should talk so much more about that than data centers and infrastructure and LLMs. I think the idea that we're ever going to compete on the foundational LLM layer is just so dumb that it really pains me, actually.
I couldn't agree with you more. Every time I hear about it, I'm like, why are we, why we have such limited resources, why aren't we focusing on where we have an unfair advantage? And actually, that would be the same thing I would say, like, know yourself as a founder. What's your unfair advantage? Do you think you'll have an easier time attracting exceptional talent here or in Singapore or in the US? Do you think you'll have an easier time selling to customers if you're here or in Singapore or in the US? And because if you go to the US, you're going to compete with Americans who are amazing at selling things. I mean, if anything, we know how to talk our bum off. And so you have to be, I think, really self-aware about where you as a founder are going to be most successful, not just which country is going to help me most, because there could be a billion resources you have access to, but if you don't know the right people or know how to interact in that culture, it could be irrelevant. Yeah. And I think founders need to think about that.
Charles. Thanks, sorry.
Hello. Sorry, Giles Pratt, Freshfields. We're a law firm. I'm not going to ask the regulatory question. That's already been asked. I do kind of want to know what's on your Christmas list, though, because I think we've had a lot of different discussions about what sovereign AI is and isn't. Sounds like it could be very useful for defense. Maybe it's not needed for the rest of us. If you come back to talent, does that mean that we want UK government to really focus on our universities and making sure that people there learn how to fly out of them? Because we work with a lot of businesses that are coming out of universities, a lot of people who want to buy those businesses. We get very different stories about whether they're supported by their university ecosystem, whether they're really kind of set free, or whether the university is still kind of trying to claw into their IP and their equity. I'm just sort of curious, what is it that we can do to really turbocharge it other than make Hyde Park prettier?
I'll give you a few suggestions. I think first, on like the spin-out ecosystem, I think it's a total disaster. And I think any entrepreneur who has seen both the US ecosystem and the UK ecosystem from the inside will agree with that. The fix is very simple. At Stanford, if you want to spin something out, Stanford takes 5%. You go to an office, it takes 2 weeks, you sign a paper, off you go, commercialize your research. So there's a lot of people that do that, right? They take 5%, I think that's pretty fair. Try to spin out something from a UK university.
Oh my God.
First of all, it's a 1-year process. They want 45% of the company, which makes it totally uninvestable. And you're just like, you're kneecapping people from the beginning. So just make it a rule. Like if you're a university and you have spin outs, 5%, 2-week process, hope for the best. That's gonna work. That's gonna mean you're gonna get so much more spin outs happening in the UK. Second one on talent, I think talent visas that of course about speed, getting people to the country quickly, but also gives real like economical benefits so that we increase the brand, not just by Pretty or Hyde Park, but here's a great proposition, move to the UK for 4 years, enjoy Europe, enjoy the culture, and also make more money than you would in the US. And last but not least, I think to the point, I totally agree with the fact that we need to build the ecosystem. My point was not that it's bad to take capital from the US, but if we could have pension funds invest more in VC funds so that 10% more of my cap table at this stage was owned by UK or European-based funds, then that flywheel is going to run a lot faster, right?
Imran, you will have heard people say these things. Why do they not happen?
I'm not there anymore, so that's...
No, I know.
Yeah.
That's what I'm able to ask you.
I mean, I think the university thing's like, it's not like I mean, this is like a known problem for many, many years, and I wasn't that close to sort of like the efforts to sort of like deal with that, and there's probably like lots of institutional sort of cultural reasons within universities, but this is a thing that people have been talking about for years, so it is a really, it really does need to sort of be...
There's a mafia of people, investors
solved.
that make a lot of money from this.
Yeah, and it's just kind of like, it's a cultural sort of sentiment type thing, which just feels like quite a journey that we still need to go on. On the other thing I was going to add was, maybe to the original question about why the UK, I think as sort of AI sort of moves into the wider economy, it's not just like the AI sector, it's much more kind of like every sector. And so like what are the things that the UK is already good at, life sciences, financial services, there'll be lots of domain experts in those sort of areas. Can you build new companies that sort of like pull people out of banks and pull people out of sort of AI research and whack them together and create a new AI native bank? Can you do that in life sciences? And so I think it's sort of not just AI talent, it's going to be what are the other things that the UK is brilliant at, which there are some things that we are great at. And so like, could the next $1 trillion UK company come out of those niches?
And do you, just to finish, Joe's point about the camps, one of the questions that I've got is do you think it is feasible to be in both camps if you're advising government now, could you say, look, we're going to be able to have a relationship with China and some of its, platforms and services, ditto the US, or does everyone have to choose?
Well, I mean, as they said in the panel, like lots of US companies in Silicon Valley are using Chinese models.
So we're going to be able to. Okay.
So it's going to be it's going to be quite messy and complicated, I think. And so
you mean though for a country that is not the US or China?
Yes, exactly. I hear. My hunch is that in the end, the UK is going to find that its current phase of kind of, imitative China bashing is not going to last because they're going to have relationships with, China suppliers. That's my view, but it may be totally wrong.
Well, yeah, but I mean, even earlier this year, I don't remember when the National Security Conference was, but J.D. Vance came and basically stood up there and said, we don't really want to think about working with Europe because you guys are so slow and you're so into regulation and we're a totally different place. And then he left the dinner and everyone was talking about it for weeks. And it was so rude. But right after he spoke, some representative from China got up and said, we're happy to work with you. Yeah. I think that's it. The reason I'm skeptical about not quote unquote choosing if you are another country and you are important enough for one of these countries to care politically is just because of the leadership today. But that could change. I think you have to be extremely malleable. And if you're going to be long-term greedy, think about, okay, I'm going to align with something to this extent today, but I'm going to be really thoughtful about building a relationship with this other thing for later. I actually think it requires a lot more strategic thinking long-term.
Well, on that note, strategic thinking long-term, I'm going to invite everyone to come to the bar where lots of strategic long-term thinking has historically happened. So please do stick around and have a drink. Imran and Victor and Juliette, thank you very much. And likewise, Serena, Joe and Patricia, thank you. Also to a fair number of people in this room, I'm not going to name you all because I'll get it wrong, but there have been so many people who've helped us with the thinking on this index. And over the years, kept on kicking the tires on it and trying to make sure we got to something worth doing. Just so you know, editorially, for us, it really feels worth doing. It kind of anchors us in change over time, and few newsrooms kind of try to do that. We really want to. We also know that this thing is moving really fast, so if there are better ways of doing it, please let us know, let me know, let Serena, Jo and Patricia know. But for this evening, thank you very much for being here, and please thank Imran and Victor and Juliet and Serena and Jo and Patricia.
Thank you.